Chapter 8. The Priest. It was not long after Grandfather had told Rick and I of his first journey to South America that I began to get deeply bothered by something Grandfather had said during the story. He had said that all people of the earth were connected on a spiritual level. It was these children of the earth that shared a common belief, a common ground. Though their beliefs were slightly different in approach, they were almost identical in the final analysis. However, Grandfather could not say the same for the white man's religions, and that was the reason for my deep pondering. I did not know whether Grandfather had meant that he thought that the white man's religions were fraudulent, or if he just didn't know. After all, for a while I was raised in the white man's religion, and I could not believe that it was wrong. The sheer thought of it bothered me for days, and I began to brood about it frequently. One night, while sitting around the campfire, Grandfather asked me if there was something in the story of his journey to South America that was bothering me. He noticed that my mood had changed soon after he had told the story and how he wanted to know why. I didn't want to hurt Grandfather's feelings, nor did I want my worst fears to be confirmed, so I was a little hesitant in answering Grandfather's question. Instead, I tended to circumvent the question and ask about other unrelated parts of Grandfather's journey. It did not take Grandfather long to realize what was bothering me. Instead of asking me about that which still remained unspoken, he immediately began to tell me the story of a priest, which I knew would ultimately answer my unasked question. Grandfather had been slowly wandering back from his first trip to South America when he encountered the priest. He had not been driven in his travels since he left the jungle, and rather took his time throughout the entire journey. He wanted to stay in areas longer so that he could explore the various landscapes and try to find teachers along the way. The spirit that usually drove him on his journeys and quests had remained silent for many months. He was very content just to learn as much as he could. Many times he stopped along the way for several weeks, especially in the places of old Mayan and Inca ruins. He knew that these places were spiritually active, and he wanted to know all there was to know. Though he was not familiar with these cultures, he sensed something similar to his own philosophy. He would search out anyone who still practiced the old religion, but many times he could not find a teacher. Some of the old ones that he encountered told him that their original religions had changed and changed again, and became more complicated every time. Still, there was the simplicity that No Name had so often spoken of that could be found in the complication. Grandfather knew, through the story shared by these old people, that these cultures had been destroyed, much as had the culture of the tribes of the United States. Here, too, greed and the consciousness of destruction had almost entirely removed a people and the religion from the face of the earth. Grandfather could not understand how the white man's religion could permit him to create the destruction without fear of punishment or reprimand from that which the white man called God. One late afternoon, seated high in an old Mayan temple that overlooked the jungle, Grandfather was compelled again by the Spirit. He had been looking toward the north, thinking deeply about the question of white man's religion, when he knew that he had to leave this place and journey north. There was no doubt in his mind now that his many months of rest and leisure would soon come to an end. Even as he walked down the steps of the temple, he knew that he could not wait for the morning to leave, but had to go immediately. To remain for even a few more hours would only produce a deep restlessness that would prevent any kind of rest, sleep, or even preparation for the journey. There was no hesitation or afterthought, for Grandfather just walked to his camp, scattered it to the earth, and headed north under the night sky. As is typical of this type of journey or quest, he did not camp for more than a night in any place. Just enough time was spent to replenish supplies, and then it was back to the trail again. As he reached the deserts of Mexico, more time had to be spent gathering water, and that slowed his progress as usual. This time the Spirit did not lead him up the west coast, but straight through the center and into the hottest and most barren of deserts. However, these conditions Grandfather knew very well, and the travel was easy. Most people would perish under these same conditions, but Grandfather flourished. The earth took care of him, and he obeyed its every law. The farther north he traveled, the more the spiritual voice within him nagged. For the last few days of his travel, the Spirit would not allow him to stop, rest, eat, or even sleep. Grandfather could sense an urgency in the spiritual drive, and he had to obey it without question. He began to push himself to the limits of his endurance. The lack of sleep caused Grandfather to hallucinate at times and made travel very difficult. Several times he nearly fell to sleep standing up. Since he could not stop, his water supply began to dwindle, and he had to ration the rest severely, which only added to his pain. Finally, late in the last night of his journey, he came upon a high ridge where he knew that he would make camp and get some rest. Though the area he had been led to would not be an ideal location, he sensed that this was where the Spirit wanted him to be. He built a meager shelter between some huge boulders and quickly fell into a long and unconscious sleep. He was abruptly awakened the next day by the sound of a bell ringing in the distance. It took Grandfather quite a while to regain a sense of time, place, and reality. Such was the intensity of his profound sleep. After regaining consciousness and realizing that the sound of the bell was a reality and not a dream, he cautiously crawled from his boulder shelter. Carefully, he climbed to the top of the ridge, staying very low to the rocky ground. It was apparent now that there must be some kind of settlement below that he had overlooked in his fatigue of the night before. From the ringing of the bell, he knew that it must be that of a white man's church. As he peered over the side, he was startled to see a small adobe church surrounded by other adobe structures, all in poor repair. Grandfather suspiciously eyed the little hamlet. Except for the ringing of the bell, the compound looked utterly deserted. There was no sign of human or animal. The few wagons that were around were badly broken and weather-beaten by the harsh desert weather. Grandfather knew, however, that there must be someone there as the bell was ringing, and there was still a few human tracks around the front of the church. He watched the compound and buildings for the better part of the morning, long after the bell had stopped ringing. Finally, a few people emerged from the church. They were poorly dressed and looked to be near the edge of starvation. Their journey back to their houses looked labored and painful, showing clearly the way the desert was beating them. Finally, from the huge door of the small church stepped a very old priest, or black robe, as Grandfather called them. He looked as badly worn as did the rest of the people. Grandfather watched him cross the courtyard and head slowly in the direction of the ridge where Grandfather was watching. As the priest drew close to the outer edge of the compound, Grandfather could plainly see that the black robe was not like other black robes he encountered before. The robe was tattered, torn, and dry soil color. The old priest did not look very healthy at all. There, too, was a pain and weakness in his walk. Grandfather had to shift his position closer to the edge of the cliff to follow the priest. The priest continued to the bottom of the cliff and to the remnants of a small well. The priest then lowered a bucket into the well, but did not seem to retrieve any water. It was obvious then to Grandfather why these people looked so badly. They were out of water. Grandfather watched the old priest kneel by the side of the well, apparently in prayer. Grandfather felt a powerful calling to go down to the priest. The driving force was so strong that he had to set aside his fears and obey. He still feared the white man, and this priest was definitely a white man, though no one in the compound looked strong enough to do Grandfather any harm. However, he knew the power of white man's guns. It doesn't take a strong man to be a warrior with a gun, so his climb down the cliff was very slow, cautious, and very quiet. He did not want the priest to see him until he could determine if the priest was a threat or not. Grandfather moved like a shadow, deftly shifting his position to a point where he could get a clear view of the priest without being seen. As usual, with Grandfather's skill as a scout, this became a very simple process. Grandfather was close enough to hear the priest's every word and was startled by what he was saying. The priest spoke in Spanish, a language that Grandfather could barely understand, but the meaning came through. The priest prayed, "Holy Earth Mother, the physical manifestation of God's love, help us. My people are without water. Our wells have run dry, and we are dying. Many have lost faith and have run away to other places, but those who remain still believe that we must be here. Oh God, we need your help." Grandfather immediately knew that this old priest had to know something of the native people and what they believed. Such was the wisdom and intensity of his prayers. To Grandfather's astonishment, the priest called out and said to Grandfather, "Come here, brother." Grandfather could not believe that anyone could have detected his presence there, but he stood and moved toward the old priest without question. Grandfather moved to the other side of the old well, using the old rock wall as his last buffer between himself and the old priest. In the old priest's face, Grandfather detected a kindness, the reason for which could not be put into words. Grandfather began to reluctantly move toward the old priest as he beckoned Grandfather to him. Grandfather detected no sense of threat from the old priest, but rather an unconditional acceptance. As Grandfather moved closer to the priest said, "You must have been sent by God. You are one of the children of the land. Would you please show this old priest in what way to ask our Earth Mother how to get water from this old well?" Grandfather was struck speechless by what the priest was saying. For everything he had heard about the black robes, this statement was totally out of character. Grandfather sat down by the old priest and listened to what he had to say. First, the priest introduced himself as Father Juan, and then went on to tell Grandfather of his plight. He had lived here for many years with a small community of people who just barely eked a living from the barren land. Several years earlier, the well began to run dry during various times of the year. Now, in the past year, it had been without water more times than not. Because of the water shortage, many of his people had left the area and had gone off to find better places to live. The old priest wanted to leave long ago, but he felt that God wanted him to stay here, and he had to obey. He told Grandfather that every day he came to the well to pray for water, but to no avail. To Grandfather, Father Juan seemed like a very sincere and dedicated man. Even though the water had not returned to the well, the old priest would not lose faith. Without hesitation, Grandfather told the priest that he could help him find some water for his people. In Grandfather's heart he knew that there was still water around, but no longer in the place of the existing well. The vegetation, the color of the earth, and the faint smell of water in the air confirmed Grandfather's decision. Grandfather then climbed down into the deep well as Father Juan looked on. He felt and smelled the walls of the well and dug a little into the earth at the deepest place. Though the sands were dry to the touch, they were not dusty. Grandfather expected that the well still contained water, but at a deeper level than the well had been dug. Climbing out of the well, Grandfather explained to Father Juan that the well was not deep enough. He told the priest that was the reason that the well ran dry periodically throughout the year. It was only during the wet season that the well would produce if left in this way. It had also been very dry, almost a drought for the past several years, and that is why the well no longer produced. As Grandfather talked, he could see tears forming in the old priest's eyes and a look of thanksgiving on his face. Instantly, Grandfather could sense something different about this old man. To Grandfather, he seemed more like Coyote Thunder or No Name than he did a priest. There was the same air about him, the same feeling of oneness that Grandfather could feel in other shaman. He could not explain the feeling, for it conflicted with all that he had heard about the white man's religion. The priest called out toward the village, and 2 men came running toward them carrying buckets and shovels. They looked at the priest and at Grandfather skeptically, yet they obeyed Father Juan when he asked them to help Grandfather dig the well. Grandfather climbed into the well despite the priest's comments that he had done enough. Grandfather dug for most of the morning without stopping, and by high sun he had hit water. As the bucket of soil mixed with water was hoisted to the surface, Grandfather could hear the cheering. With each subsequent bucket he heard more and more voices cheering and talking, though he could not tell how many. Within the next hour the well was above Grandfather's chest with water, and he could dig no more. As he slowly climbed back up the side, buckets on tethers began to come over the side, hoisting the water past him. As he emerged from the top side of the well, he was met with a small cheering crowd. As he stepped away from the well, Father Juan walked right up to him and gave him a big, affectionate hug. Clearly, Grandfather saw that the priest was crying. Father Juan then turned to the small crowd and exclaimed, "This is truly a miracle. This man has been sent by God to bring us back our water. This man knows the voice of our Earth Mother, and the earth told him where she had water." Grandfather was shocked at the priest's statement. He did not feel like he had been sent by anyone, for it seemed just by chance that he had arrived here when he did. He told the priest so, but Father Juan responded saying, "Then what is it that drove you so far out of your path? What power was it that guided you here?" There was no question in Grandfather's mind that the priest was right. He had been driven to this place, especially near the end of his journey. It was the spirit within him that had led him here at just the right time to help these people. There was no denying in Grandfather's mind that the priest could see deeper than Grandfather had originally given him credit for. Grandfather, at this point, began to see that the priest knew much more than he was letting on to his congregation, or to Grandfather. Yet as they looked at each other, they could both sense a power in the other. There was a mutual respect, a common ground that they both seemed to share. As the people hoisted bucket after bucket of water from the well, Father Juan asked Grandfather if he would stay with the people for a while and teach them of the earth. Grandfather was a bit hesitant at first, but he knew in his heart that was why he had been led to this place. He also knew it was not just that he had to find water for the people, for it seemed like there was much more to learn before he moved on. He now could finally understand the urgency of why that spirit had driven him so hard these past few days. He could plainly see that these people had no water at all and probably would have been dead within the next several days. He could also feel a deep draw toward the old priest. This old one was someone special, much like No Name, and he sensed that this was who the spirit had guided him to see. It took the well and the problem of the water to bring them together. Grandfather did not believe in coincidence and knew that he had been sent. Grandfather decided to take things one day at a time. He had no sense of how long he was to stay in this place. At first he would not enter the church. Fear from all the stories that he had heard about conversion and brainwashing still haunted him. He would not even sleep near the compound at night, but chose to go back up onto the ridge. He did not like the feeling of confinement that he felt in the compound and preferred the freedom of his camp. Each morning at sunrise, then again at sunset, Grandfather would sit and pray. He was startled to see that the old priest did the same as he. The old priest seemed to have a special spot on the land, as did Grandfather. Several times they waved to each other as they went into their areas. It then struck Grandfather that if the priest could pray in his church, that of the temples of creation, then he could go and pray in the priest's church. From that point on, Grandfather had no apprehension about entering the church. With each passing day, Grandfather began to respect and admire this old priest. They would sit up in the hills for hours, teaching each other and discussing religion, beliefs, and philosophy. Grandfather began to see a deeper connection between No Name and Father Juan. This old priest, though still believing in his religion, had expanded it beyond what his church taught. Father Juan, whether by accident or design, had indeed transcended his religion and now walked the shamanic path. Grandfather was startled to find that Father Juan believed in many of the things that Grandfather did. So, too, could Grandfather sense that the priest was trying to change some of the ways of the church, and that was probably why he ended up in this place. It was not long before Grandfather and Father Juan began to pray together each night on the ridge. They would discuss the wisdom of the Spirit well into the night, and soon Grandfather found how deep Father Juan's philosophy ran. Grandfather soon discovered that Father Juan's path was almost identical to Grandfather's, though he approached it in a different way. The end results were the same. Father Juan told Grandfather of his endless years of spiritual searching, asceticism, and working with people of the earth. He told Grandfather that at first he wanted to convert the Native Americans, but as he grew older he began to listen to what they had to say. The first thing that the old priest learned was that they all prayed to the same God. This became evident whenever the priest prayed, for he always began the prayer with, "God, Great Spirit, you who are called by so many names and worshipped in so many ways." Father Juan also told Grandfather that he believed that the earth was a physical manifestation of the Creator's love, and we should take care of his gifts. He also said that to him the earth did feel like a mother, and all the things of the earth were his brothers and sisters. Father Juan told Grandfather of the man called St. Francis, who could actually walk with the animals and know them as friends. The old priest seemed as interested in Grandfather's philosophy as Grandfather was in his. They began to compare. When Grandfather would tell Father Juan something he believed, Father Juan would find evidence of it in his own religion. When Father Juan quoted the Bible, Grandfather would show the priest evidence in Grandfather's beliefs. It was obvious to them both that they were finding a common truth, a common path that bound both their beliefs together as one. Grandfather spent the season with the old priest. He showed the priest, now growing congregation, how to work the fields more effectively. He taught them how to care for the earth, to work in balance with its power. He also taught them to listen to the many voices of the earth and to have faith that the Creator would provide. Most of all, Grandfather and the priest spent every available hour together. They taught each other, creating even a broader understanding than either could have ever imagined. In the end, Grandfather began to look at the priest with the same sense of brotherhood as he had No Name and Parrot. There was no doubt in Grandfather's mind that the white man's religion was part of all philosophies, and through that belief anyone could learn to walk the path of the shaman. Most of all, what Grandfather learned from the priest was the wisdom of Christ. Grandfather could not understand, however, how the simple teachings of Christ had become so complicated. Christ had no church, for he taught in the mountains and in the gardens and in the wilderness, and his teachings were a simple truth. When Grandfather confronted Father Juan with this question, Father Juan told him that was why he was a priest. Father Juan felt that his mission in life, similar to Grandfather's, was to find and reestablish that simple truth, free of man's meddling and complications, then pass this truth down to others despite what anyone thought. In the final days together, Grandfather taught the priest how to use the sweat lodge and why it was a universal spiritual truth for all who used it. Their first and last sweat together was a richly spiritual experience. Two men from different cultures, different ages, and different beliefs, both praying to the same God. As Grandfather headed back to his people, he felt another great sense of loss, and like the connection to Parrot and No Name, Grandfather could feel the same connection between Father Juan and himself. Grandfather knew in his heart that someday the philosophy of Father Juan would spread across the land. He also knew that he would never see Father Juan again in the flesh, but knew that they would pray together again in their shared world of spirit. My mind was at peace after I heard the story of Grandfather and Father Juan. I could see now that Grandfather felt that all religions and beliefs were connected by the same spirit. Grandfather knew that all paths finally led to the Great Spirit, provided man can reach the purity of his own religion and see past all religious dogmas. I also, at this point, vowed to be as open as Grandfather had been to all philosophies and religions. I finally understood that they all had something to teach. There was no right or wrong, just the truth. From Grandfather's story of the priest, I learned to be open to all people, no matter what the religion or beliefs. I have learned to forget that I have a past, and to empty my cup, so that I could listen to people purely, without their teachings being filtered through my own prejudice. I've learned to listen and to work my way through their words and arrive at the common truth. Through this, I have learned that there are more things common to all the various religions and beliefs of the world than there are conflicts. Once I realized this common truth, I have been able to accept that there is but one truth, just many different paths leading to it.